Well, what if you played a kid, but like not really a kid? Something that it does appeal to me about Tendertwig is just the like unquestioning belief in yourself. Yeah, they just spontaneously produce this healing fruit from time to time off of their body.
It's a little bit disturbing.
Yeah, I took a Leshy ancestry feat called Harmlessly Cute. And it basically, is like, it gives you like a small bonus to pass yourself off as, I'm harmless, I'm adorable.
Hello, friends. Welcome to Characters Without Stories, a TTRPG podcast about the roads not yet traveled. I'm Star. This episode, I'm joined by Tori Fica. Tori is a TTRPG enthusiast, actual play performer, and GM. She is one of the creators of Level 1 Geek, a TTRPG education and entertainment channel to help new players get into this magical hobby. Tori, I'll give you a chance to plug all your projects at the end, but do you have anything you want to tell listeners about yourself?
Hi, I'm just excited to be on here. I live in California. I've been playing TTRPGs since, my gosh, I always like freeze up when I think about this. Since 2015 was the first time I played, I believe. My good friend bugged me for months and months and months to finally try it. And so I honestly did just to appease him. Then completely fell in love with the genre, and well, the rest is history. So I'm sure my story matches a lot of other people's out there. But yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
Did you start with D&D or did you start with another TTRPG?
Shockingly, no. I started with Pathfinder 1st edition, which to this day I don't know how I stayed in this hobby, given how difficult and complicated Pathfinder 1st edition is. So many numbers to crunch. But I found a way, and, since that's where I started, pretty much every other tabletop RPG I've played has been simpler than that one. So I'm like, oh, wow, okay, great.
You're bringing a character today for Pathfinder, right? 2nd edition, though.
Yes, 2nd edition.
So who are you bringing to the table?
So I am bringing Tendertwig, who is a Leshy Oracle.
Well, let's start with, what is a Leshy?
A Leshy is essentially a plant creature, basically a moving, talking plant. When I was thinking of sort of the look for Tendertwig, I was actually thinking a lot about the little Korok seeds in Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild. And that is a lot of the vibe that I kind of channeled for Tendertwig. So a Leshy is a plant creature. I was also very interested in their lore for Pathfinder 2nd edition. Their lore is basically that they are an eternal spirit that just finds home in this like plant body for a time, and then whenever they're done, they basically kind of reincarnate maybe into another Leshy. So like the Leshy idea of sort of life and death is kind of feels more long-term, like eternal, because it's sort of just this eternal consciousness that comes down for a time and then moves on to the next adventure, which I think is kind of neat.
In the lore, do they retain the memories from all of their previous incarnations?
I think they purposely kind of leave it up to you. Paizo is not like overly prescriptive with how you have to play a certain type of character, but I think you could probably play a Leshy that maybe remembers some stuff from past lives or nothing at all. Tendertwig, I kind of played with that idea because they're an oracle, as I said, and I made them, their domain essentially is lore. So Tendertwig is extremely knowledgeable and knows a lot of stuff, but they're only a year old. And so I kind of played with, they don't really have memories per se. They don't consciously remember past lives, but that's how they kind of just randomly know a lot of stuff, because they'll get these flashes of insight from their essentially past lives or just what they've learned so far in the existence of this eternal soul that is inhabiting this current form.
If they're 1 year old, are they like a toddler in terms of capacity? What is that like for them?
That is basically how I decided to play them. I thought it would be kind of funny and fun to play like sort of a baby character, but with, like I said, these flashes of just unnatural or rather supernatural insight and knowledge, and therefore magic capability. So obviously level wise, they are, proper adventurer. Well, they're at the beginning of their career. They're only level 2, but they don't know a lot about the world. So they have a lot of questions and curiosity around things that you learn from experience, but they know a lot about things that you would maybe learn from like books or just knowing stuff. So they're definitely not very street smart, but very magically book smart.
Sort of the typical wizard kind of trope.
Yes, yeah. But then paired with Tendertwig not even really knowing how they know certain things. At least wizards are like, I read that in a book. Tendertwig is like, I don't know how I know that, I just do.
Is Tendertwig interested in finding out how they know those things?
Tendertwig is generally unbothered by everything. Because they are so endlessly curious, they don't really question experiences, they just soak it all in. So I don't think that they have really recognized that it's weird that they know things. They just accept it as the reality. They just do. And they're happy with that. But certainly their companions, the people around them, are a little mystified by this little quirk of Tendertwig's.
What is an oracle?
So an oracle has a mystery. So for Tendertwig, I chose the lore mystery. It's basically just their theme. It's like a domain for clerics or something like that. They also have a curse that comes along with their mystery. So they have this extra power by tapping into just kind of their innate, if in Tendertwig's case, like knowledge and stuff like that, but it comes with kind of a downside. So Tendertwig's curse that goes along with their great knowledge is the more they lean into their knowledge, they kind of become disconnected from reality a little bit. And that manifests physically. I think they start floating or something like that. It's been a while since I've played Tendertwig, but basically, if they lean into their power, it also comes with this curse that manifests, and the curse can have its own effects, and sometimes the curse can actually kind of amp up your power, but it comes at a risk, and so you have to weigh how much you want to lean into that versus being a little more cautious and staying away from progressing your curse too far.
Do you think Tendertwig is interested in leaning into that? Are they the kind of person that would be scared of those kinds of risks, or are they more of just a kind of go for it character?
Yeah, like I said, I think Tendertwig doesn't do a lot of questioning of experiences. So I don't know that they even necessarily see it as a curse, but rather just something that happens whenever they do this. And so I don't think they are especially excited to lean into it, but they also aren't really scared of it. It's just not really a concern. In addition to being kind of unbothered and unquestioning of experiences, I think coming along with that is sort of a just ceaseless optimism. An assumption that everything is going to be okay. Just like kids have, like kids move through life just kind of assuming that things are going to be fine. And yes, kids get scared and they see bad things happen, but I think that most children sort of operate from the assumption that like life works out and like they'll be safe and things will be fine. And so Tendertwig certainly operates from that perspective as well, just assuming that things are going to work out and be fine despite how it might look in the moment.
Why was that compelling to you, this idea of playing this very childlike character?
I like the idea of that kind of curiosity and optimism basically being a superpower. I mean, I've definitely played my fair share of, gritty, dark characters with tough backstories, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. But I kind of, for this particular character, I thought it would be fun to explore like a character who's just thoroughly enjoying every experience that comes their way. Even the experiences that might seem scary or dangerous or bad. And I think, just the curiosity and optimism being basically the source of their power. I thought that was kind of a compelling idea.
Is that the spark that led you to create this character? Is that kind of where you started, or did you have a different starting point?
To be honest, kind of going back to the Koroks, I honestly think that maybe those were kind of my starting inspiration. I just was delighted by how, like, they're just so goofy and silly, and, like, why are they there? They're just, like, so logicless, but delightful at the same time. And I feel like Leshies, just as an idea in the Pathfinder universe, feel similar. Like, it's just walking, talking plants. It's just kind of silly. That's really what I was excited about. And then thinking about, well, what kind of Leshy would I want to play, or what kind of personality would I want to give to this adorable little plant? And I just thought that starting with, like, well, what if you played a kid, but, like, not really a kid? Leshies age differently because they are these, like, eternal souls. So a Leshy being 1 year old is very different from, you know, a human child. So I just thought it would be fun to sort of unlock that childlike wonder and optimism and silliness without playing a literal baby as part of the campaign team.
You don't want to hurt a child. That would just be...
No.
Yeah.
No harming little kiddos. Plus, you know, you want a character who can still be useful to the team, even if you're going to play kind of a funny, fun personality. And so I liked the idea for Tendertwig.
I am really fascinated by Leshies, and I'm kind of curious. So do they start out as just a regular plant and then they get inhabited by this soul, or do all Leshies start as Leshies?
As far as I understand, I don't know if this is 100% of the time, but I believe that the lore is typically a druid, a very powerful druid, will essentially infuse a Leshy soul into, like, a plant creature. It sounds like it's generally kind of like a druidic ritual that leads to the creation of a Leshy. Like I said, I'm sure Paizo would be the first company to say you can have whatever origin story you want for your Leshy, but that, I think, is typically the origin. Tendertwig themselves, they don't really know where they came from. Like, in my backstory for them, they never knew the druid that, quote unquote, breathed life into them, and it's just not really a concern. Like everything else in their life, they look at it as, well, I'm here now, and so I'm just here to, you know, experience everything I can.
What kind of plant, or I guess it can also be like a fungi, right?
Yeah, there are different types of Leshies. Tendertwig is a fruit Leshy, so they grow a fruit, basically. I think it's every day or something, and the fruit can be eaten, and it does, like, a little tiny bit of healing. Yeah, they just spontaneously produce this healing fruit from time to time off of their body.
It's a little bit disturbing.
It is a little. That was, like, a kind of what I wanted to capture with Tendertwig, is, like, funny and fun and silly and cute, but also this undercurrent of, like, that's kind of weird. Like, it's kind of disturbing. You know, I referenced, like, the flashes of insight. I kind of played that as Tendertwig basically going into kind of like a fugue state and just, like, zoning out completely and just reciting off, like, monotone, this info dump of whatever they're remembering, almost like they're channeling this, you know, knowledge, and then they would kind of snap out of it and be back to normal. And so I wanted to play with this bundle of disturbing cuteness, basically.
It's nice to have those kinds of contrasts in a character. I always find that really fun.
Yeah, definitely.
How does gender work for Leshies? What pronouns does Tendertwig use?
I suppose Tendertwig would probably say any. I don't think Tendertwig really cares. I usually use they, them for Tendertwig, and Leshies generally aren't overly concerned with gender, typically, you know, because they're plant creatures, and so it doesn't really factor in as heavily for them. But, you know, I think you could gender your own Leshy however you wanted to. But yeah, Tendertwig doesn't really understand that idea, like, at all. So they don't really care how someone refers to them.
How did they hook up with their adventuring party? How did they start their adventure?
The background I chose for Tendertwig is fortune teller because, you know, they're an oracle. I thought it'd be kind of fun to play with the idea of they have these flashes of, like, knowledge and insight and, like, fortune telling. And so the way that they joined this party that they're a part of, or they were a part of, is my friend's character. He put together a character who basically is just this young guy, just on the cusp of kind of adulthood, who believes that he's destined to be a a great hero. Not really for any like reason. He's not like that great at anything. He just is kind of caught up in his own fantasy that he's going to be a great hero. And so while we were making our characters, he and I talked and we decided that that's basically how these two started adventuring. Is they ran into each other. Jimothy is this other character's name. Jimothy ran into Tendertwig, and Tendertwig had, as a fortune teller, basically told Jimothy that, yes, actually he was destined to be a great hero. And Jimothy latched onto that as gospel truth and believed it 100%. And Jimothy's faith in that kind of bolstered Tendertwig's faith in that idea. So they both sort of together convinced themselves that, yes, Jimothy was going to be a great hero. Tendertwig decided that sounded like a good idea to tag along and help Jimothy become a great hero and also see just all the adventures along the way. Together, the two of them are kind of just fun and fancy-free, traipsing through life to go get Jimothy's destiny of being a great hero.
Does Tendertwig have any goals of their own?
Tendertwig, I think their main goal is learning. And it's almost like Tendertwig doesn't even know what they don't know. You know, when you're just so new at something that you're like, I know I'm going to have 10 million questions. I don't even know what those questions are yet. I don't even know what to ask because I'm so near the beginning of what's going on here. And I think that's how Tendertwig kind of feels about life in general. They're new to this adventuring life. They're new to this great quest of Jimothy's to become a hero. And so I think they're kind of figuring out what it is they want as they go. And so currently their goal, I think, would be to help Jimothy fulfill his destiny, or what they all see as his destiny. But if I were to continue playing Tendertwig in the future, that would be a fun question I'd like to explore is, as they grow and learn, do they kind of make up their mind about what matters to them?
Hello everyone and welcome to 5 Gems in a Trenchcoat.
Excuse me?
Yeah?
What's that?
You want to know what 5 Gems in a Trenchcoat is? Let us tell you.
It's the adhesive that keeps the fragile pieces of my sanity together.
Well, okay, Jesse, what it actually is a narrative-driven TTRPG actual play where 5 friends take turns weaving stories through the tabletop game of their choice.
Of their choice?
Each season?
Each season.
That's pretty cool.
I disagree.
Oh.
I feel it's the adhesive.
So, like, you guys aren't all in a trench coat?
No, we're definitely in a trench coat.
How does that work?
Get her.
Before I'm caught, you can check out 5 Games in a Trenchcoat just about anywhere you get your podcasts, or you can check out our website at 5gamesinaTrenchcoat.com. Oh my god, they really are all in a trench coat.
Tell me what Tendertwig looks like.
So as I said, Tendertwig was generally inspired by the little Korok seeds. And so I would say with your mental picture, you can start there. They have a cute little mask. It's like a leaf, but they themselves they're less woody and more plant-like. They are short and round and they grow this fruit, as I said, but it's actually from their staff that they always have with them. And so this little staff is the thing that grows the fruit at the end of it. So they're just this short, stout, tiny little round plant creature with a little leaf mask and a staff.
What kind of fruit do they grow?
I think it is unidentified fruit. I think it's
Mystery
just
fruit.
Yeah, exactly. I think that adds to the slight disturbing feeling of like you don't even really know what you're eating. But I always pictured it as like a big, bright pink berry or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Does Tendertwig have a voice?
Tendertwig does have a voice. Tendertwig's voice is baby voice, basically. I just did a baby voice for anytime Tendertwig was going to talk, much to the chagrin of my game master and the laughter of everybody else.
Well, I can skip all the questions about Tendertwig's family because Tendertwig doesn't have parents, really, per se.
Yeah, not traditionally. I will add, though, that Tendertwig, I think, considers Jimothy family. They sort of latched onto each other. And so Tendertwig is probably the closest thing that Jimothy has to family, because Jimothy, I believe, is like raised as an orphan, very kind of classic adventure backstory. And then, obviously Tendertwig doesn't have any real family connections. And so Jimothy was the first person they latched onto. So I think they're the closest thing to family for each other.
Mm-hmm. So going into more of the details of how you built this character in Pathfinder, but maybe not getting too specific, what is Tendertwig good at?
Tendertwig is intelligent and also charismatic. Those are probably their best, all of the mental traits, basically. Physical stats, they don't really have much to offer in the way of physical combat, but oracles are charisma casters, if I'm not mistaken. So that was the stat that I focused on. Plus, I felt like that fed into the idea of Tendertwig just being very adorable and kind of a natural air of like, oh, like I just want to take care of this little plant. And then, of course, the intelligence and wisdom sort of coming from their past lives, even though they don't really consciously remember those things.
Did they have any special skills besides their kind of magical abilities that come with being an oracle?
So as far as special skills, a lot of the mental associated skills, obviously knowledge checks, I think is probably what they're best at, knowing things about stuff or stuff about things and being able to provide that kind of information to their teammates. Whenever we kind of stopped playing where we left off, we were sort of in the midst of solving a mystery, which as we were playing through it, I felt like Tendertwig was really excited about the intellectual exercise of solving a mystery and like tracking down clues and interrogating people and putting all the pieces together. They were like really excited about that process. And so I think that I would wrap that up in their special skills. They're not that useful in combat as far as direct combat, but they are really good when it comes to talking to people and just thinking through complicated problems or information.
Personally, when you play a game like Pathfinder, what's the balance of roleplay and combat?
I do enjoy both. It was kind of a fun challenge to figure out Tendertwig's place in combat because they're not really an overtly combat proficient character. But as a spellcaster, I was focused mostly on buffing my teammates and being helpful in that way. Personally, I do enjoy both. I would say if I had to put like a percentage on it, my preference is probably, 60% roleplay, 40% combat. I could go a whole session without combat and enjoy it, but I probably can't go like 2 sessions without combat, if that makes sense. And then vice versa. If I get too much of one, then I start to like miss the other aspect of it. So I enjoy just like a good mix. And I also really enjoy finding ways to infuse combat with roleplay, so it doesn't really have to be as stark a division between the two elements of the game.
Right. Does Tendertwig have any unusual quirks besides, being a toddler?
That's I would say kind of their whole personality is just a bundle of unusual quirks. With our latest arc of the adventure we were playing through, a mystery, I decided to just like really lean in hard to Tendertwig being so over enthusiastic about this investigation. And of course it's a quest, so like the whole party was on board to do this, but just like Tendertwig just diving straight in, just fully adopting the detective persona and loving every second of it. And so I think besides Tendertwig being a toddler and having these weird flashes of knowledge, I think also I would say one of their quirks is perhaps just their blind enthusiasm for something that they get excited about and just the great force of passion that can overtake them whenever they decide that something is interesting.
Yeah. Do they have any flaws?
I mean, I would say maybe that's kind of a flaw too. I think the other side of the coin to like blind enthusiasm or just sort of a generally unquestioning attitude toward life and an openness to experiences is also blindly trusting everyone and everything. again, sort of leaning into that childlike nature. Tendertwig doesn't really have stranger danger uh, or a good handle on who to trust. And therefore, they actually, I guess this is another little quirk of theirs, they detest lying. They hate lying. They feel completely betrayed if they ever found out that anyone ever lied to them. This came up in a game of the party. We were all at like a tavern, of course. We were playing some kind of dice game, Liar's Dice or something like that. And Tendertwig was just completely offended by the whole concept of that game, that you were making a game of lying. And so dishonesty is something that like Tendertwig cannot handle. And I think that kind of goes along with their blind trust of the world around them that goes completely against how the world should work in their eyes, at least.
I imagine there's going to be a lot of disillusionment for them as they go out into the world.
Perhaps. Yeah, that might be true. Fortunately, the tone of this particular game, which might give some more context to Tendertwig, it was kind of a silly game. We were playing through parodies of our favorite movies or shows, or like the GM was like taking inspiration from like pop culture things. And suddenly we would find ourselves in the middle of a plot that was oddly familiar, like, this seems a lot like Firefly or whatever, but, all the character names would be different. So we were purposely kind of parodying a lot of things that we just as players enjoy. And so I think in a grittier campaign, there probably would be a great deal of disillusionment and tough lessons for Tendertwig. In this particular campaign, I'm not sure how much reality checking we're going to have for Tendertwig or not. But yes, I think that eventually Tendertwig will have to come to terms with the fact that sometimes people lie and that sometimes there might even be a good reason for that. But right now they are unwilling to accept that idea.
You mentioned in your submission that you had only been able to play a few sessions maybe before the game fell apart. And the game you're talking about, this kind of parody, lighthearted type of game, one of the questions I often ask is, what kind of game does this character need? Like if you were to pop them into a different game, what kind of game would be ideal? But it sounds like in this case, you could go with what you were going with in terms of this kind of lighthearted, funny campaign, but it might also be interesting to put them into something a little bit grittier. Do you have a preference or a thought on that?
Yeah, I think that could be really interesting. I also wonder, too, how Tendertwig would feel in a game with a more eerie, almost like horror vibe, because they sort of have that slightly disturbing undercurrent. And I think that would be kind of interesting to sort of take such a cute little guy and put him in such a different kind of tone. I do think Tendertwig worked well for the game that they were in, but it's fun that you bring that up of like, how would it be in kind of a more serious game? And while I didn't get that opportunity with Tendertwig, I did actually, I played a different game at some point and played a character who definitely, it wasn't the same as Tendertwig, but kind of had a similar sense of optimism, and the world is ultimately good, and people are good, and that kind of thing, and just got to explore that arc of sort of coming down to reality of like, that's not always the case. The good guys don't always win. Sometimes bad guys get away with stuff, and all that kind of complexity.
Did you have any particular type of arc in mind for Tendertwig if you were able to play them?
I do think it would have been interesting to explore more of understanding where their knowledge comes from and understanding maybe some of their past lives. Actually, I think another thing that would have been very interesting would have been to go on this journey with Jimothy and find out if Jimothy ever got to the point where he became disillusioned enough and decided, like, maybe this whole prophecy thing wasn't real. Maybe I'm not actually supposed to be this great hero. That would have been an interesting thread to explore with Jimothy and Tendertwig together, because they're both so committed to this vision and this quest. And so to see that maybe not come to fruition, or maybe to see that vision have to evolve and change as they just see more of, reality.
Do you have a headcanon as to whether this prophecy is actually true or not?
Oh, what a good question. Gosh, off the top of my head, I don't know that I ever decided, because, it's also kind of hard to decide things like that for like if you're not the GM, for example, like I wanted to just leave it very open for the story to go in whatever direction it needed to. I suppose now, though, if I can make my own headcanon, I think I would lean toward the prophecy being actually true. Jimothy and Tendertwig are characters that nobody around them would view as particularly heroic, I think. They're very, Tendertwig is very non-threatening, very strange, adorable, harmless. Yeah, I took a Leshy ancestry feat called Harmlessly Cute. And it basically, is like, it gives you like a small bonus to pass yourself off as I'm harmless, I'm adorable. So anyway, I don't think Tendertwig is someone who anyone would believe is destined for any kind of great heroics, and then by extension, Jimothy. And so I kind of like the idea that Jimothy and Tendertwig move through the world believing in their dream, and everyone else kind of looks at them with an attitude of, oh, you sweet summer children. You'll learn, you'll see how wrong you are. But then for that to win out in the end, for them to actually be correct and just show everybody else that actually they were the ones who were incorrect in their assumptions. So I think that's maybe my headcanon, is that they go on to prove the prophecy is in fact true.
I love the idea of the unlikely hero kind of winning out in the end and proving everyone wrong.
And doing it not with a chip on their shoulder. Tendertwig is not like out to like, I'll show you. They just see that as, duh, that's just what's going to happen. And so if they reached that ending, it would not be a surprise to them, nor would it be some great like victory. It would just be, well, yeah, that was always what was going to happen.
They're not plagued by imposter syndrome.
No, not at all. They don't know enough to know that maybe they should be plagued with imposter syndrome. I think that it's interesting they bring that up too, because I do, now that I'm sort of talking more about Tendertwig, and this whole conversation is really forcing me to think about like, where did this whole idea come from? And I think that something that it does appeal to me about Tendertwig is just the like unquestioning belief in yourself. And that is not something that's easy to do. I think that's why it's like a fantasy character for me, because that's like, I'm totally someone, like most adults, I think, move through their lives with some form of imposter syndrome, or, oh, like I'm not doing enough, or I'm not good enough, or whatever. And Tendertwig, it literally never occurs to them that they should even consider feeling that way. And so that's kind of like a fun mentality to explore. Just like, man, what would life be like if you just had not that like you were cocky or overconfident, but just had full faith in yourself and the path you were headed on? What would that unlock for you?
Yeah, I love that idea. That seems like it would feel really freeing.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, Tendertwig certainly felt very free about it, very unconcerned.
So you talked about how the initial inspiration came from Legend of Zelda. How do you normally get an inspiration for a character? Is it something you see out in the world like that, or are there different ways that you find inspiration?
Probably most often for me, it is inspirational come from games I've been playing, or books I've been reading, or movies I've been watching. Typically, though, I would say that's where like the seed comes from, but then it'll kind of morph and change as I just think about it more. I'm not usually someone, like, I don't enjoy playing just a straight one-to-one, like, oh, this is my favorite character in Lord of the Rings, so I'm going to recreate them here and play Aragorn, for example. And if that is exciting to you, like, there's nothing wrong with that. I like to feel like the character is my own in some way. So while I might take the seed of an idea, like a rugged ranger man, that's cool, I'll then kind of take that and chew on it and think about it and consider, what can I make unique about this character, or what sort of other things can I add to make this character feel like not just another Aragorn, but, my character, my version of this. Also, I don't know why I used Aragorn, because I don't think I've ever played like a gritty ranger, but it was just a hypothetical example.
In your submission, you mentioned that you were interested in playing this character because you're interested in playing with these ideas of like timelessness and immortality. Do you often approach characters from that kind of thematic standpoint? Like, I'm interested in this theme or this idea, and I want to find a way to play with that.
Yeah, I would say that's true. I'm playing a changeling rogue right now, and the idea for that character came from reading about like changeling lore, and that basically changelings are children of hags, and they all hear the call, which is basically like the call to return to their hag mothers. And what happens after that is kind of a mystery, but like they are somehow changed into hags or consumed or something, you know. It's a grisly end, I think, is implied. So I was just thinking about that, and so then questions kind of came like, man, what would it be like to live with like this doom hanging over your head? What would it be like to be a character who is trying to just forever outrun their destiny? I would say that's where a lot of my character ideas come from, is a more thematic kind of thing. Or like I've played another character who is a fighter, and I think my idea for her was I really wanted to embrace the full kind of vanilla concept of like shield, sword, knight. Like, because I just never played such a, you know, classic character. But then I also liked the theme of someone who's very friendly, but like incredibly fierce. So anyway, yeah, I think that's just sort of where my ideas start, is I find little questions or themes or even kind of unexpected combinations that feel interesting to me and are like, ooh, like I want to explore that. So like Tendertwig, like what would it be like to kind of be a child, but also kind of know everything? What would that be like?
I know that a lot of people mostly subconsciously bring parts of themselves into their characters. I mean, most of the people I've talked to on the show have done that, but a lot of them do it without realizing it. Do you think this is something that you do either consciously or subconsciously?
Oh, absolutely. I think both for me. I think that there are definitely characters where I have felt more consciously like this feels like this part of me, or I recognize as like I want to explore this character because I want to kind of explore this element of my personality or whatever. But definitely there's a lot of subconscious Tori that leaks into all of my characters. I'm quite confident. I'd say for Tendertwig, I think I'm generally a pretty enthusiastic person and someone who, when I decide I'm interested in something or excited about something, I dive into it like 100%. And so I don't know if I did that consciously with Tendertwig, but that's definitely like some of the pieces of me that I feel like Tendertwig embodies, is just like this, all right, I'm excited about this, I'm going to dive in 100% and throw caution to the wind. And I definitely don't have all of Tendertwig's personality traits. Hopefully I don't. That would be a little bit upsetting, I think.
You mean you're not growing fruit?
Yeah, I'm not growing fruit and I'm not actually a child. But yeah, there are definitely pieces of me in, I think, every character I play.
Mm-hmm. Tendertwig, are you superstitious?
Well, I just think that superstitious is actually when people don't know that something is magic. And so I don't really think I'm superstitious, because usually everything has an explanation. You just don't know it yet.
Thank you, Tori, so much for coming on the podcast and for sharing Tendertwig with me today and with my listeners. What would you like to share? What kind of projects do you have coming up?
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun. It was such a fun trip down fictional memory lane to talk about Tendertwig. So thank you so much. For anyone listening, you can learn more about everything I do at level1geek.com. I'm part of a team. We do an actual play podcast and YouTube series, plus a bunch of just educational blog content for anyone looking to learn more about tabletop RPGs, or learn how to roleplay your character better, or find out what dice to buy, and all kinds of stuff. So you can find all of that at level1geek.com. And I promise that I don't talk in a baby voice for any of my other characters. So you don't have to worry about that.
Well, I'm sure some people would be very disappointed to hear that.
That's true. Okay, well, I do use, if for people who are like, oh, bummer, I can offer you instead that I do frequently cosplay for our YouTube VODs that we post of our actual play series. I'm actually playing a male character. His name is Jack, and so I have like a full makeup beard, and it's so, I think I look so strange. Like I see myself and I'm like, man, I actually kind of look like a dude. It's really interesting. So maybe that will pique your interest instead.
Well, thank you so much, Tori. Please go check out Tori's website and all of the actual plays. I was just watching is it Basin or Vasin? I always forget.
I've heard both, and I think maybe either one is correct. I personally say Vaesen, but I will not judge anyone who calls it differently.
I love to see actual plays that aren't D&D. It's always warms my heart a little bit to see, the kind of the proliferation of non-D&D games.
Absolutely. We play a bunch of different ones. We love any and all TTRPGs.
For my recommendation this episode, I'd like to introduce you to a podcast called I Love This Thing So Freaking Much. I had Sophie on the podcast in my first season talking about her Kenku character, and I was on her podcast talking about, of all things, Doris Day movies. I Love This Thing So Freaking Much is a 15-minute dose of positivity. It's unsurprisingly fun to listen to people talk about something they love. I started a newsletter. If you'd like to get a behind-the-scenes peek at the podcast, follow my other projects like my current all-woman actual play, and be notified when a new episode drops, you can find the sign-up form in the show notes or on my website. Please share the podcast with a friend. Word of mouth is the best way to find new listeners. Your recommendations help me immensely. Thank you to all my listeners spreading the word. I'm so grateful. You can find me on TikTok at StarMamaC or on Threads, Blue Sky, Instagram, and Facebook as Characters Without Stories. You can also listen on YouTube at Characters Without Stories or follow the link in the description. I am currently accepting submissions, particularly for non-D&D characters, so if you'd like to share your character, you can go to the submission form at characterswithoutstories.com. Thanks for listening. May all your characters find their stories.